We'll take you to Kids Connection. Enjoy your time. We'll see you back in at the end. Well, good morning and happy Mother's Day once again. Sorry I'm having to wear all the hats today. It's actually because of Mother's Day, actually. We've had some of our extra helpers, our other worship leaders, our drummer, that sort of thing. Those guys are out because they just had babies. So they're celebrating Mother's Day from home. I think some of them, if they are even awake right now, I heard from DJ and Sam that their baby was waking up every hour and a half to eat overnight, which, man, a lot of us have been there. That is a rough time. So if you guys are awake and watching from home, happy Mother's Day to you, and happy Mother's Day, first Mother's Day to some of those infants that we have as part of our church as well. So as we think about Mother's Day today, and as I was kind of preparing for my sermon this week, I was trying to sum up my view as a man and as a husband of what modern womanhood is like, at least in my limited perception. And I think that a single word that could kind of summarize a lot of it to me, from what I see, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is the word pressure. I think a lot of women feel a lot of pressure to live and be a certain way. And I can even perceive that from my seat as a man that doesn't fully identify with that at all. Now, there's tremendous pressure for you to be everything and more. There's pressure for you to meet certain standards, to raise great kids, to be involved in everything, to cook, to clean, to work, to somehow have hobbies, to be a good friend, a good wife, a good daughter, a good sister, a good mom. And there's also the pressure to do it all while somehow still appearing stylish enough to post it onto Instagram. Because if you didn't post it, then your friends might worry that you're still alive, right? And as we continue today in our study of Proverbs, in the series that we've been doing for the last several weeks called Basic Instructions, we're going to look today, maybe somewhat predictably for some of you, at Proverbs chapter 31. If you're familiar with the Bible, or if you're familiar with kind of church culture, Proverbs 31 has probably come up for you if you are female, right? It is typically something referred to as the Proverbs 31 woman. There are conferences devoted to Proverbs 31 and how women should live in this way. There are many books written about Proverbs 31 and how to be that kind of Proverbs 31 woman. And if you're looking at a physical Bible with me today, you'll see the heading a little bit lower down in Proverbs 31 that says either the excellent wife or the woman who fears the Lord. Proverbs 31 in some ways presents some sort of an impossible ideal. In fact, for many women, the very mention of Proverbs 31 instills that feeling of pressure. Because if you've heard it before, if you've been exposed to it before, you have felt this kind of pressure to be all that the Proverbs 31 woman is. But as we look at this passage today, as always, we want to understand and interpret it within its context and within its style. And we want to understand what God is actually telling us in this. Not just women, but men also. What is God communicating in this passage? And what I hope that you'll find this morning is not pressure, but instead pleasure. The entire book of Proverbs is meant to challenge readers to live according to God's intention and design. It is filled with basic instructions, practical applications for how to live as God would desire. So really, if you feel that Proverbs 31 is unintentionally putting pressure on you as a woman, understand this. The entire book of Proverbs are ways that we all should live. And maybe it's wrong for Proverbs 31 to be directed specifically at all this pressure for how women specifically should live, when in the light of the rest of Proverbs, this is how all people are supposed to live in the light of God's wisdom. And Proverbs 31, while it is somewhat descriptive of or directed towards women, is just like the rest of the book. It sets an incredibly high standard for living in wisdom. In fact, the standard is so high that it may feel like an impossible pressure. But for Christians, we should understand this. We do hold ourselves to an impossibly high standard. We, as Christians, as believers in Jesus Christ who have been redeemed by his grace, hold ourselves to the standard of his holiness, the standard of Christ-likeness. in our understanding of this is that it is not a pressure, it is not a requirement for us to be saved, it is certainly not a measurement of our value, but no, it is our pleasure to live in the way that God has designed. It is our growing desire, if we're redeemed by Jesus, to live in a way that pleases the God who loved us and purchased us by the blood of his Son. It is our great joy to be free of the sin that was killing us and to instead walk in wisdom. It is not pressure to live perfectly. It is the joy of what we've mentioned each week as we've examined Proverbs, of what we call transformation. Christians understand that living in wisdom, not just of Proverbs 31, but for the whole of Proverbs and really for the whole of the Bible when there's directives for how we should live, living in those ways is not just a will of ours, but it's God changing our will. It's God transforming us to be as he would intend us to be. Which is why it says in James chapter 1, verse 5, it says this, "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him." So yes, we could read Proverbs, and especially Proverbs 31, and think to ourselves, well, I can't do that. I can't live up to that standard, and we would be right. Or we could read it with a heart that says, I know this is a lofty goal. I know this is a high standard, but I also know that because of the work of Jesus Christ, I am being transformed into who God would have me to be. And I can ask God, as we read this, to say, even in the areas where I feel I fall short, that God would help to raise me to that standard. I ask for wisdom, and without reproach, God will give it to me. God leads us in the wisdom that we see in Proverbs, and particularly Proverbs 31. So before we really get into the excellent wife portion, let's begin to best understand what is leading up to this description by looking at Proverbs chapter 31, verses 1 to 3. It kind of explains the context of the passage, and it says this, "These are the words of King Lemuel, an oracle that his mother taught him. What are you doing, my son? What are you doing, son of my womb? What are you doing, son of my vows? Do not give your strength to women, your ways to those who destroy kings." Okay, so this is establishing what we are approaching as we approach the description of the excellent wife. And there's a couple of things that we should really note here. First of all, unlike the majority of the Proverbs, especially the ones that we've studied in previous weeks, this one is not attributed to Solomon. It is attributed to someone named King Lemuel. Now, this is a little bit odd in the Bible because this is the only mention in all of Scripture of this person. We don't necessarily know who it is. So there's a little bit of throughout history, scholars have said, well, maybe Lemuel was another name that Solomon went by. So maybe this is actually Solomon. Or some have attributed it to a person named Hezekiah, but we don't really know that to be true. This King Lemuel probably was not a king of Israel, but maybe was even a king from elsewhere who also was seeking wisdom from God, who learned from Solomon, and especially has learned from his mother. So as we read this Proverbs 31 description, we should understand, first of all, that it is not a prescription for how all women should live, but it is a advice given from mother to son, right? She's saying that this is what you are to look for. Now, in that, it is assumed that King Lemuel, the son to whom she is speaking, it is assumed that he is pursuing wisdom from God. And his mother's encouragement is for him to seek someone who is doing the same. We saw earlier in previous weeks in our study the passage that says, "He who walks with the wise becomes wise, and the companion of fools will suffer harm." And clearly, as this passage begins, we see those possibilities play out, right? If that rule of influence applies in our regular interactions and friendships, then it certainly applies in the realm of romantic relationships too. This mother sees her son Lemuel falling into a trap, and she says, "My son, what are you doing? Women who you seek should also be held to the standard of God-given wisdom, and he would be wise to seek women who are wise." So the general principle that I think we see as we approach this chapter, kind of the framework that we're looking at this through, because it's not just for women, it is for men, it's written for a man by his mother, is this. The first blank on your sheet, if you're following along on your handouts, is this. That it is wise for us to seek spouses that fear the Lord and pursue wisdom. if one wishes to live wisely in the commands and the design of God, then he must also seek to pair himself with someone who is doing the same. There is mutual benefit in this. It is very much like the passage that we looked at just a couple weeks ago, that when as iron sharpens iron, one man sharpens another. That's not just true for men, right? Iron sharpening iron, that idea should also be true in our romantic relationships, in our marriages. We should expect, and this is the premise here, that Lemuel was seeking wisdom himself, that he had been taught the wisdom of God, that he was learning to live in the ways of God. So then it should make very much sense that he should seek a woman that is doing the same thing. We should be with like-minded, God-fearing people in our friendships and in our marriages. Plus, as the mother warns, pairing himself with an unwise woman or an unwise wife, she said, can lead to a king's destruction. History has proven this to be true, particularly in the history of the people of Israel that comes after this. We see very many examples in the history of Israel of kings that paired themselves with women who were not seeking the Lord, and they suffered destruction as a result of this. Think of King Ahab and Jezebel as an example. So what we're reading in Proverbs 31 really is kind of a continuation of what's been presented through this book of wise sayings, that living in wisdom should lead us to walk with others who are in that wisdom, right? That we should pair ourselves with others who are also seeking to live God's way. And as the mother's warning continues, we don't have time to read every verse of it today, but as she continues through verses 4 to 9, she basically discourages King Lemuel from things like drinking and partying and getting involved with foolish women. And instead, she pushes him in verses 8 and 9 towards justice for the poor and needy. And then we finally get to this famous portion of Proverbs 31. The Proverbs 31 woman, the excellent wife, the woman who fears the Lord. And as we enter this section today, recognize that this is a metaphorical example. Throughout the book of Proverbs, we have seen several times that wisdom itself is personified as a woman. We were told in the beginning to hold her close, to make wisdom our intimate friend, that she is kind of personified as a woman. And wisdom, for the sake of communication, has been personified throughout the book this way and ends the book in the same way. So for our interpretation, we should see that this is, once again, not just about a literal woman, but really about a choice between wisdom and foolishness. In fact, in the original Hebrew in which this was written, this part from verse 10 onward is a poem. It is called an acrostic. So in the original Hebrew, each line begins with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet in order. So it's written in such a way that they would read it and memorize it as a poem together. So this is not meant to be, for our understanding, a checklist for what every woman should be at all times. It is not pressure. It's an example of all that can be accomplished when a person seeks wisdom and fears the Lord. It is not a description of what a woman must be, but rather a description of all that a woman can be as God leads her in wisdom. It highlights and praises the application of the wisdom presented throughout the whole rest of the book of Proverbs and the powerful effect that it can have in a woman's life, but also in the lives of her husband and her family and those around her. And again, as we read this idealistic example, my hope is that you don't feel pressured and condemned for all the things that you are not, but rather that you will feel honored for all the things that you are, and also challenged to pursue all that you can be as you seek to honor God by living wisely. So let's look at the section together. Proverbs 31, verses 10 to 11. We won't get to hit every single verse through the end of this, but we'll hit most of it to kind of draw some general principles. Proverbs chapter 31, verses 10 to 11 says this: "An excellent wife who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life." You can see this kind of in stark comparison to the warning that we saw at the beginning of this chapter. This mother is telling her son, forget those foolish women, those who do not seek the Lord, those who do not know wisdom, and instead pursue this. There's a comparison happening here. A woman who embodies the God-given wisdom that we see presented throughout Proverbs is unique and rare. Because she fears God and respects his design and his way, she stands out as uniquely valuable, more so, as it says, than precious jewels. So I think a general idea, if we're trying to make a list of what is Proverbs 31 describing about a wise woman or a wise person, is first of all that a wise woman is uniquely valuable. In contrast to the women who seek personal gain by leading the king towards sin, we see this picture of a woman who is on the same track, on the same path, seeking the same goal of living in wisdom and within God's standards. If a man seeks to honor God with his life, and he finds a wife who seeks to do the same, understand this: they are a powerful force together. As the verse says, she does him good. She empowers him to live obediently and vice versa. He can trust that what she does is good because she is seeking the same goal and the same values and the same wisdom that he is. And because of that, they will be, as the New Testament describes, equally yoked. They are bound together, moving in the same direction, and as a result, they will see no lack of gain. They will in unison seek to please the Lord together, and they will together enjoy the benefits of living in God's wisdom. This is the wisdom that we see here. It is good and wise for a man to seek out a wife that honors God, with the assumption that he also is seeking to honor God and live by the same standard. The two then can be unified, seeking what is good and wise together. And I understand for some couples this can be a real sticking point, especially if you come to faith after your marriage, or if one person comes to faith in God and the other person has not. There is going to be a resistance there. There's a difficulty and a challenge there. And yes, as an individual, you are called to follow God, to try to live to his high and impossible standard of holiness, to become like Christ. And that will be so much easier if your spouse is in on this with you. It is a huge interpersonal difficulty. It causes so much stress and pain in people's lives when they are not on the same page, on the same path, working towards the same thing. But as I said, if two spouses both love the Lord and are pursuing him, even in their imperfection, even through failure, they are together. And they are a powerful force. So finding a wife who is running after the Lord in the same way that Lemuel is assumed to be is uniquely valuable. Now, the description of this wise woman goes on in verses 13 through 19. It says this. And this is where it gets kind of interesting and a little weird for women in modern times. It says this: she seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands. She is like the ships of the merchant. She brings her food from afar. She rises while it is yet night and provides food for her husband and portions for her maidens. She considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hands she plants a vineyard. She dresses herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable and her lamp does not go out at night. She puts her hands to the distaff and her hand holds the spindle. So, I know that seems a little strange. Not many of you ladies have worked with a spindle recently or really gathered wool or flax, at least that I'm aware of. But there's a concept here that I do think is important, a concept that comes out often in the Bible. The Bible seems to value hard work. Yes, we have a God who provides, and yes, we are living with the hope of an eternal kingdom. But in our lives here, we are called to diligence and hard work. We are expected not to be lazy or slothful, but instead to offer our best. So this metaphorical woman exemplifies that well. So the next kind of quality that I think we see is that this wise woman works hard. She is the embodiment of so many proverbs that concern hard work. One, for example, is Proverbs 16:3, which says this: commit your work to the Lord, and your plans will be established. We see that presented in her here, right? A wise woman will work hard because God honors hard work. Even in the New Testament, we see this idea reflected in the book of Colossians chapter 3, verse 23 to 24, speaking specifically to bondservants, but really something that can apply to all of us. It says this, "Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ." So, ladies, you may not be in the wool or flax business. Chances are it's been a while since you have beefed up your arms and made them strong by handling the spindle and the distaff, whatever that is. I had to look it up. It's a part of a spindle, the shovel, basically, right? You guys haven't done that recently? That's okay. You may not be in any official business outside of managing your family, and that is okay. The expectation is not for you to always, at every moment in your life, always juggle career and family and hobbies and friendships. No. The example is that in whatever you do, whether you are a woman who works and has a business or whether you're a woman who stays home with your kids, whatever it is, the expectation is for you to work diligently at those things, for you to work hard. This verse doesn't impose a pressure for you to do everything, but simply sets an example that in everything you work as though you're working for the Lord. A wise woman doesn't have to do it all, but in all that she does it for the glory of God. So as you seek wisdom, you should seek to provide for your family well, however you are able to do that. The expectation is that in wisdom you work hard, knowing that God honors hard work and that it is a benefit to those around you. Which kind of leads into the next verse. In verse 20 it says this, describes her saying, "She opens her hand to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy." In this we see that a wise woman, the next blank on your sheet is this, she cares for those in need. Remember, we didn't get to read it, but I mentioned that in Proverbs chapter 31, verses 8 to 9, as the mother is talking to her son, she encourages him to care for the poor and needy. She says that he should open his mouth for the mute and stand up for the rights of the destitute. He was expected to, in his wisdom, care for those in need. It is the responsibility, I believe, for those who know God, for those who love God, for those who understand and value what God values and sees human value for what it is, that people are made in God's image, that those people should be cared for, that there is a world that needs help, and we, as followers of God, should be led to help those people. But I would argue, from personal experience, that in general, men are not quite as good at caring for others as women are. It's part of how we are wired in a way that women are genuinely very caring for other people. And sometimes I think that what we could recognize here is if they're both seeking wisdom, sometimes one's going to carry a load or put pressure in other areas than the other person is, right? That sometimes men need wives that care for the poor and needy and encourage us to do so. It is good for wise and God-fearing women seeking wisdom to care for those in need and to encourage their husbands to do the same. Now we're going to skip down a couple of verses past some more fabric sales to verse 25, and we see another important aspect of this woman in her life. It says this, "Strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs at the time to come." And this is maybe a little more metaphorical, maybe a little more deep passage in this little chapter here. It's kind of a little bit fascinating. While it does speak to her outward appearance in a way, it's also talking about something that's inside, right? She clothes herself with strength and dignity. It's an inward reality for her. It says that she laughs at the time to come. In other words, this is not a woman who is fearful of the future. She's not constantly worried about what could go wrong. She isn't bothered even by the natural effects of her own aging, thinking that she looks too old. No, this woman laughs at the time to come. She presents herself with dignity and strength. She has an inward security that is clearly seen on the outside. So I think what we could draw from this is that a wise woman feels secure in the Lord. She is able to laugh at the time to come because she knows the one who holds the future. Now, things may certainly not go the way that she hopes. Bad things do still happen. Things may indeed seem very dark at different moments in life, but She believes wholeheartedly in a good God who is loving and powerful and able to redeem. And in addition to that, she isn't ashamed of the signs of her own aging. She is clothed with strength and dignity. God has created her. God knows her fully and loves her. He has led her this far, and he will lead her much further. She has this assurance of faith that is undeniable. She exudes confidence, not in herself, but in her loving Father. Now, continuing on, let's look at verse 36 to see another quality. It says this: she opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. This carries right along with last week's lesson. If you were with us last week, we talked about our words and how many Proverbs speak to the way that we are supposed to speak. And right here we see that this woman embodies that kind of wisdom by speaking wisdom and kindness. A wise woman speaks wisdom and kindness is the next blank on your sheet. Now, to be very honest, I am super thankful to have a wife that speaks kindness and wisdom often. In a way that I cannot, my wife is able to speak to my kids. In a way that sometimes I fail to, she offers them wisdom in a way that they maybe wouldn't hear it from me. Often, her voice of truth is uniquely valuable and beneficial to our family, and honestly, it's a benefit to our church. The guiding, caring, nurturing, challenging words of women and mothers have the power to change the course of history. Our words matter, as we talked about last week, and we need good, wise women to speak kindness and wisdom. Look down just a little bit further at verses 28 to 30. As the chapter finishes up, it says this: her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. As Christians, I understand that this can be a difficult point sometimes. Oftentimes, I think that we focus a lot on humility, and humility is absolutely a virtue and a value. We want to be people who are humble. But there are qualities that we see in people that are worthy of admiration and honor, things that should be praised. This wise woman has worked hard and done much for caring for her family and seeking to live wisely, and as a result, she receives honor. So the next blank on your sheet is this: a wise woman is worthy of admiration and honor. It says her children rise up and bless her. Kids, keep this in mind later today as you celebrate Mother's Day with your children. The Bible says you should rise up and bless your mothers. Her husband also does this and tells her, many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. She should receive honor for following the Lord the way that she does. Now, for all the women and moms in this room that find yourself feeling often less than other women, who sometimes suffer from comparison syndrome or possibly even envy, consider this. As the verse says, charm is deceitful and beauty is vain. What you see from other people on Instagram or Pinterest or in person, wherever, is probably not the reality. And even if it is the reality for other women, there is a greater measure. There is a more important aspect to your personhood, a different way to value yourself. A woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Remember, as the Bible has told us, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And if you are seeking wisdom, if you are seeking to know God, to know his love for you, to live within his purposes and plans for you, even if all the other areas that we've covered today and more feel like failures for you, you are worthy of honor and admiration. Your kids' birthday cakes may be store-bought. Your hair may never be done the way that you want it to be done. You may have worn yoga pants for the better part of the last year. You may lose your temper sometimes and yell at your kids. You may be too exhausted from work and life to give your husband the attention that you would want to give him. Your house may be a mess, and frankly, chances are unlike the example of wisdom in this text, you probably don't have a thriving wool and flax business. Let me ask you this, women. Do you fear the Lord? Are you seeking God's plan for your life? Are you seeking to live in wisdom? Are you offering your very best even when it feels like you're falling short? Are you seeking to bring glory and honor to God in your family, in your relationships, in your business, and in all of your life? If the answer is yes, count all those other things as failures and instead receive honor and admiration that is due to you, because a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. And men, you are not off the hook here either. Again, the whole assumption of this passage is that the man is seeking wisdom and that he's finding a woman who is on the same track as him. You are not only to set the example and come aside your wife and all these things, but also to encourage and praise that you see God acting in her life as you seek wisdom together. Mother's Day is not necessarily a religious holiday, but I believe that it's good that we celebrate it together. While this metaphorical picture of a woman that we see in Proverbs 31 who embodies wisdom may feel like an impossible standard to live up to, this is what I do know for sure. In this church and in my personal life, there are women who have exhibited the qualities of absolutely working hard. There are women here in this room that I know for sure push very hard to follow God in his wisdom, who at many times and in many ways have shown care for those in need. There are women here in this room who have a strong security in their faith in God. There are women here in this room, as I said before, whose words of spoken kindness and wisdom have made a difference in my life and in the life of our church. There are women here who are worthy of admiration and honor for the way that they follow God. And here's why. We can say this in faith because we're not just praising you for your good decisions and your choices. We're not praising you for what you have done. By praising the good things that we see in you as you walk in wisdom, what we are doing is we're saying, God, thank you for working in and transforming us. We know that in our sinfulness, in our depravity, we are unable to be what God would have us to be. And yet, God, by his grace, if we put our faith in Jesus Christ and the finished work that he has done on the cross, leads us to be better than we can be. God changes us. As the verse in James says, we ask God to give us wisdom, and God gives it to us abundantly. So yes, I praise God for the wise, hardworking, truth-speaking women in our church, because that is an act of God being done in them. So women, and especially moms, we are grateful for the work of God displayed through you. Receive the admiration and honor today. And as much as this impossible ideal of a wise woman may seem out of reach, let me encourage you to continue to pursue it, asking God to help you to live in this way. Let's pray together as we finish for today. God, we are thankful that even when we feel inadequate, even when we feel like some of the examples in Scripture, not just in Proverbs 31, but throughout the Bible, feel so difficult for us to live up to. We're thankful that you're honored in our efforts, that you receive glory as we seek to be transformed by you. God, I know the pressure that is on women and mothers specifically. God, I pray that you'll help to relieve that today. And instead of feeling intense pressure, God, I pray that you'll help them to seek to please you in all that they do. And when they fall short, God, we know that there is grace for that. Thank you for your work among us. Thank you for the women who are so strong to help carry this church and push it forward even as we begin. And God, thank you most of all for your work on the cross, that you have made it possible through your Son, Jesus Christ, for us to be transformed into his image. We praise you for these things, God, because we need you to change us.